Aliye Cornish, CEO of the Irish Baroque Orchestra. Thank you so much for joining me here in the Kevin Barry Room ahead of the Irish Baroque Orchestra's concert live from the National Concert Hall stage here. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the pandemic. How has it treated you, or how have you treated it?
Yes.
That's the end of that.
That's a good place to start. Yes. The pandemic. So, yes, we're quite a way into it now. And it's been a funny time for me personally because I've not been in the country all that long, all things considered. So I moved here in July 2019. So I had about 6 months of settling in and got to January of 2020 and thought, I found my feet now. Everything will be fine. And boom, everything changed. So it's been a time for a lot of thinking and planning and a time for introspection for the organisation, which has been really good. And we turned 25 this year, which is pretty cool.
I wouldn't have thought that. 25, amazing.
We don't look a day over 18. So we've been looking back over what we've done to date and thinking about what we want to do in the future and planning it. And the lovely thing is that as things are opening now, I can talk to you and say I'm absolutely confident that the next 5 years are going to be really exciting for us. And that's a lovely feeling. So actually, it hasn't treated us badly at all, if I'm honest with you.
Good, good. That's a nice positive note to start things. So, you're a very interesting person. Like, from the point of view of a CEO, you're not like, you know, your career has been very varied over quite a long time now. And what I thought I'd do is I'd start with a quote, which you may or may not recognise. And this is a quote that's taken from an article I found from 2015. So, in quotes, "We get the final player's schedule, and I'm slightly envious of the 3 trombones.
I know where this is from.
It's indicated that they will not only be performing on stage from memory, but that they have to attend several sessions at an earlier call time to accommodate time for," quotes, "costumes, wigs, makeup." And that's a quote from an article that you wrote, which was part of a diary that you kept around September 2015 when you were performing with the English Baroque soloists at Covent Garden. And you're a viola player, or a Baroque viola player in the orchestra at the time. But it strikes me, that says quite a bit about you, because you seem to me to be somebody who, while a viola player, the viola's generally in the middle of the orchestra, just in front of the woodwinds a lot of the time. Your headspace is out and far away. You're kind of somebody who looks far away. You're curious about what's going on elsewhere, and you're possibly envious of what they're doing. They're getting the wigs and makeup. I'm not getting that. Tell us how important that is to, first of all, on 2 fronts, as a historically aware or historically informed performance practitioner, but also as a CEO. Tell us how all that works. How do you work?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I think being a viola player, you do have a special perspective. It's a relatively quiet life, if I'm honest, being a Baroque viola player, that the parts aren't usually that challenging. So you have a lot of opportunity to look around you and see how each orchestra works from the inside, which I love. And I love being in the middle of the texture. That's where I'm happy. I'm not a violinist. I mean, I can play the violin, but you don't want to hear me play the violin. You know, I'm a viola player. So I'd say, in terms of my role as CEO, I do have a different perspective on the IBO because I know what it's like to sit in the orchestra. That's the thing. And I'd like to think, and the players may disagree with me, but I'd like to think that I understand the interpersonal relationships that are at play. I think with a small orchestra like the IBO, because it's so close to chamber music, actually it's understanding the dynamic between individual players that builds the identity of that group. And before I took up the role of CEO, I had to come in a couple of times as a guest principal viola. So I knew the orchestra from that perspective already, which was a huge help in transitioning me into my role, because of course these were people who I already saw as colleagues, and that was lovely.
And how difficult, just what you said, how difficult is that transition? Because like, to go from a player to then go to somebody who's in a position of, I suppose, authority in some way.
I suppose so.
I mean, I know from my personal experience before I started conducting, I was a keyboard player, and I was the first call keyboard player with the National Symphony Orchestra for 6 years. So I played at the back anytime there was Celeste or Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, or that was me. And then suddenly, in my late 20s, I suddenly was in front of the orchestra, and that wasn't the easiest transition. Is it a bit similar from
Right.
your side, having been a guest principal viola player with the Irish Baroque Orchestra and suddenly be CEO? Well, you weren't suddenly, didn't you? Weren't you manager for a while?
I was
before?
general manager
Okay.
for 6 or 7 months, something like that, and before moving into the CEO role. And probably that did help soften the progression, actually, going through that way. Yeah, in terms of how the players have viewed it, I mean, I suppose you'd have to ask them, really. But I like to think that it means we have a good relationship because of the way I've come into the role. I think certainly there's, again, I'd like to think, and you'd have to check with them, but I'd like to think there's an empathy there that I might not have had I not come to it that way. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, it does. So you are and have been a viola player, a teacher, an administrator, a manager, a fundraiser, a writer. Would it be fair to say a trade unionist? You're heavily involved in Musicians Union in the UK.
Yes, I am.
And a mentor. Do you think a multidisciplinary mindset is, the future of CEO positions, even looking beyond the Irish Baroque Orchestra?
Definitely.
How important do you think that wide head on your shoulders is?
I think it's absolutely crucial. I think at the moment, with all organisations having to reevaluate what they do in light of the changes brought about by the pandemic, you have to have an awareness of a broader set of things than I think a CEO would have done in the past. And I'm someone who really likes having conversations with people, and I like learning about things that I don't know anything about. Actually, that's been really helpful in the last year because we have had to reframe a lot of what we do.
You also, I've read that you sit on the Committee for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. I think that's also one of the auspices of the Musicians Union in the
Yes,
UK.
it is.
What needs to be done to bring these values to an art form that in many ways can be seen to be still surrounded by obstinately high walls?
Yeah.
How do we bring that to an art form that seems to be a little bit detached from what you might stupidly call mainstream?
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, and my thinking is still evolving on this. So if you were to ask me this again in about 2 weeks' time, I'd probably have a slightly different answer for you.
Good.
But I'd say at the moment, the emphasis needs to be on inclusion, that making what you do accessible in the best sense, not dumbing it down, but finding ways to tell the stories behind what we do. Because that's the thing that really hooks people in. And it's something, it marries very well with what Peter Whalen is brilliant at. He is such a gifted storyteller. And there's so much narrative behind our programming. So actually getting Peter Whalen out there and getting him to tell the stories, that's a real gift in terms of opening up the work that we do. So we're always thinking about inclusion and making our work more accessible. Something that we've noticed, in fact, this is a really interesting thing, between the end of Q4 last year and the end of Q1 this year, we put a lot more energy into our online presence, as everyone has. But we noticed that the 25 to 34 audience grew 50%, and that the 18 to 24, it went up an extra 200% from what it was before. And that's just from us thinking a little bit more carefully about curating our online presence and what we put where. So I'd say that's a big part of it, is that inclusion aspect, is this is for you, this is for everyone. You don't need to know about the music, that's our job, just bring your ears. It's time travel for the ears, essentially, it's what we do. So it's getting that message out there so that people know that it's for them.
I love time travel for the ears. What a great phrase, brilliant. And I'm going to come back to Peter in a minute because I want to talk about Peter to some extent. For those people who maybe are dipping their toe into a Baroque orchestra for the first time, why do we need a Baroque orchestra? What is a Baroque orchestra? Why is it different to everything else that happens?
It is unique, and I suppose every organisation is going to tell you that they're unique. But we kind of are in Ireland's landscape because we are the only period instrument orchestra. So what that means in practice, for anyone who doesn't know, is that either we're playing on original instruments from the Baroque period, so broadly, I guess, 1650 to 1750, or we're playing on modern replicas of those instruments. And the idea is that everything we do is rooted in research and scholarship. So we're getting as close as we can to how we believe the works would have sounded back in the day, which I find really thrilling. I think we all do. This idea that you're putting something out there that time travel for the ears, that we're realising what we think it was from back then. So I suppose broadly speaking, that's it. And some of the instruments are different. You know, we have harpsichords, for example, on stage, or theorbos, which I guess the simplest way of explaining a theorbo is it's what you'd get if you cross a guitar with a giraffe. These enormous necked instruments that we have in our midst. And the sound of the gut strings is totally different to a modern metal string. And the bow shape is different. So there's a lightness of sound and a different way of shaping and expressing. The whole rhetoric of it is different on a Baroque instrument. And it's exciting to do it. I personally find that sort of work really thrilling. And it's something that I've specialised in when I was a student and have carried on doing. So it's lovely to be working with an orchestra here in a landscape where the scene is still developing. That's really exciting. We've got work to do. It's good.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's like, I think most people, I mean, sometimes I feel like classical music is kind of niche enough as it is. And then off that niche, there's another niche now, which is, you know, period performance, or what's called sometimes HIP, historically informed performance. But actually there's something quite mainstream, but if you look at the history of it, a lot of people in Ireland, including me, ended up at some stage when they were a child with a plastic recorder in the mouth. Yeah. And that plastic recorder was made by a family called Dolmetsch. Yeah. And the great Arnold Dolmetsch wrote one of the first great books on performance practice in 1915 on playing the music of the 17th and 18th centuries. And it was his family who developed plastic recorders. And of course the recorder is a Baroque instrument, really. It finds its roots in the Baroque times. And that's probably the one connection that most mainstream, there is something very mainstream in a strange way through that instrument, through historically performed performance. Why do you think the movement developed? Why do you think this curiosity developed to, I suppose, discover or recover the performance practice style, or the way music might have been played back in the second half of the 17th century and the early half of the 18th century?
I suppose it was the realisation at some point, I believe it was the 70s, when people looked at what was happening on modern instruments and looked at source material from the Baroque period and the instruments that they had and the shapes of the bows and all this, and read all this detail we have about how to phrase, you know, Quantz writing on playing the flute about how to phrase, very, very in significant detail, and realising actually that over time modern practices had really diverged significantly from what we think happened in the Baroque period. So I guess there was this wave of enthusiasm for it in the 70s, and Leonhardt was one of those pioneers, the famous harpsichordist in Holland. In fact, who taught Malcolm Proud, our fantastic principal keyboardist. So there is a kind of lineage there back to that. So I suppose that's that desire to rediscover and reframe what we know from that period. And it's still going, it's always evolving, and I think the idea of historically informed performance, it is slightly different to what they were doing in the 70s. Historically informed, perhaps there's scope for us to work with students on modern instruments then and share some of the ideas, and you know, you create something different in that space as well, and that's valid. Like, there's scope for different conversations around that idea. The principle of it being informed is an important one.
I think it's fair to say that the space of historically aware performance has, I think we've all grown up a lot since the 70s and the 80s, because I mean there was a period where CDs were being marketed on the basis that, you know, this is exactly what how the composer heard the music originally, and we've stuck to the metronome marks, and you can check everything, and we've got, you know, everything's tuned exactly the way it was. This is the way, and there was kind of probably a feeling for quite a while that the established orchestras or ensembles kind of felt, you know, therefore are we uninformed because you're informed, you know. But like, thankfully that we've all grown up a little bit over time, and we've learned a lot, and there's been, I suppose, some level of cross-fertilization. Where is the space now? Where is the development in the future for historically informed performance on its broadest context?
In its broadest context, I'd like to think that historically informed performance would be more of a core part of students' work in future, so that by the time you leave university or music college that you have some grounding in it for Baroque and classical. And that's where the IBO can of course help with slotting in coaching sessions and things like that, and trying to cultivate that knowledge and awareness in Ireland. So for me, I would say it's that creating well-rounded young musicians that have some knowledge of that they can incorporate into their future work, so that you end up with a modern symphony orchestra where people do still have that that awareness, they've had some study in it that they take with them into their modern playing. That would be lovely. I mean, that's a bit of a dream. I don't know how far
Actually,
it's
no,
away.
I think it's actually happening. I mean, I know I teach at TUD Conservatoire, and there is a lot more awareness now. I mean, when I was a student there, like 30 years ago, there was very little on historically informed performance at all. And literally I'd go looking for books myself and say, what is this? Why does that recording sound that way and not the way they play, you know, or what's so different about it? And I mean, when I was younger, I kind of thought this sounds vital and real to me, tangible. Whereas you listen to old recordings and it kind of sounds like, this is a terrible disparaging phrase, but elevator music where it's just played like that, just like notes that go like that. And they're all loud or they're all soft, but there's nothing in between, you know. So I think the education, you mentioned education, that seems to me certainly to be changing. So let's talk about the IBO themselves now. And your concert at the National Concert Hall will be directed by the brilliant and inspiring and the most lovely Peter Whalen.
Yes.
And it's so great to have Peter back here in Ireland. He's been away for quite a while. He's back now here. But he started with the orchestra, I think, in 2018. Was he artistic director?
That's right. January 2018 he was appointed. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how important that relationship has been for the Irish Baroque Orchestra with Peter Whalen.
It's absolutely pivotal, I would say. That Peter's brought a different framing to the work that the IBO does. There's more of an emphasis now on the Irish heritage programming, which, as mentioned before, he does so well. And it's something that he's really passionate about. And to be honest, you'd struggle to not be swept along by his enthusiasm. I mean, the way he tells his stories and the amount of time he puts into researching everything meticulously. So there's this new element now to what we're doing, and that we're really anchored in his scholarship, which is fantastic. There's also a level of ambition with Peter that it's shaping what we're planning for the next 5 years. We're conscious that he's going places. And so, you know, that's making us think naturally about, right, we need to be the best we can be and plan things with him for the next few years. So he's brimming with ideas, and we've just written a very loose 5-year plan. And we started getting his ideas down, and I thought, this could be a 10-year plan, frankly. You know, this could be, there are so many ideas there, it's great. And it's lovely that he's got such a clear idea of what he wants to achieve with the orchestra. It's really super. So it's the vision and the enthusiasm that makes such a difference. And it's a real joy to put it together with him, I have to say. We have a lot of fun.
Yeah, it comes across that way from somebody slightly outside of the orchestra. And it seems to me that your the traits that have on the various elements that have made up your career and, you know, Peter's own innate curiosity about the world around him. I'm still thinking of you being envious of the trombones, getting wigs, makeup and costumes, you know.
I have to tell you something though with that project. One thing that, the other reason for being jealous of them was they didn't have to go up and down in a cage. I was in a moving cage and I'm terrified of heights. We're at the Opera House and in the first rehearsal they winched us up to the ceiling. They did it so carefully, I didn't realise we were moving. And I remember just looking up and the ceiling was really close and thinking, and then looking down and realising, we're so high off the ground, just thinking, I'm going to be sick. I'm going to drop my viola, this is horrible. So at least the trombones got to stay on the stage. I was really, really jealous.
But I mean, your curiosity with people around you, like it seems as if yourself and Peter are sort of cut from the same cloth in some ways. Yeah. And you've mentioned a number of times the phrase storytelling.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that I'm consciously aware of all the time, that, you know, historically informed performers tell stories more often than not. And that the music is, the music of the 17th, the 18th century is more anchored in language, syntax, grammar, articulation, syllables, words, text, whereas music from the 19th century, 20th century is more pictorial and creates more images and it's kind of appeals more to our visual sensations. Tell us about the role of storytelling in not only for the Irish Baroque Orchestra, but broadly speaking for those involved in historically aware performance.
Yeah, so I think with historically informed performance, there's always this emphasis on context. That you're always thinking, why did they write this? Why did they choose that text? What was going on behind all of those decisions? Because we we're all asking questions all the time, and we want to find out as much as we can. And for example, when I played for 10 years for John Eliot Gardiner and the English Baroque soloists and his fantastic Monteverdi choir. And something he is so strong on is play the text. Whatever instrument you're playing the text. You have to write in the words in the chorales, and you're articulating. Sometimes he'll get the whole orchestra to stop and listen to the choir sing a chorale. And so you're making notes in your part at the same time, like, okay, that's a T there, and that needs to be an F, and how do I make an S? Like, thinking about that all of the time, so you get something that's really coherent. And I suppose perhaps that's where the storytelling comes in as well. It's bringing coherence to what we do so that you have the bigger picture. And of course, I suppose for this, the engagement, the marketing, for that side of it as well, of course, it's a very natural thing to say, we've put together this program that tells you a story, and here's the story, rather than coming to hear J.C. Bach, Arne, Giordani, all lovely composers, but it's just a different way of framing it that I think makes such a difference.
I mean, I saw an interview that Peter gave recently, and he referred to himself as being not an academic and more of an amateur sleuth. Nevertheless, research is at the core of what Peter does, and particularly, his research on music in Dublin and beyond in Ireland, back particularly in the 18th century. Speak a little bit about what might be seen as the confluence or the friction between academia and practical performance, because it's a fascinating area. I mean, you've also worked with the Dunedin Concert, which is directed by John Bush, who I met many years ago, and I would see him as being a dyed-in-the-wool academic. He's a prodigious reader, I know, from when I met him in Dublin many years ago. Yet he's a fantastic director of the Dunedin Concert as well. Yes. I'm curious about, where is that space, or is there a space between academia and research and scholarly work and practical performance? How does that operate?
I suppose the word informed is key again there, that it's historically informed. So you do have some flexibility, and I guess it depends as well on who your director is. So John Butt is brilliant in the way that he has all of that knowledge. He does so much reading and so much writing. His output is pretty vast. But he won't sit in a rehearsal and tell you all of those things. He'll say, I want that bit to sound like a duck, and I want that bit to sound like a goat, or whatever it is. And he just makes you laugh, but actually the way he puts things across, you know immediately what he wants. So it's that way of getting the result that he wants to hear that aligns with his scholarship and understanding, but without necessarily taking us through all of that. We don't have to go away and do all the reading. But it's the way that he communicates it to us that brings it off the page. And it's something Peter's very, very good at as well, I have to say, that he puts things across in a very unacademic way in rehearsals. I hope he wouldn't mind me saying that, but it does mean that we're very clear on what he wants.
Is it fair to say then, as a result, that all the reading and the research that Peter would do, and the knowledge he gains and the information, him being informed, is more a sense that he listens with 18th century ears and thinks with an 18th century mind and encourages everybody in front of him to do the same thing? Would that be fair?
Absolutely, I would say that, yeah. And we're slightly extending our reach now as well. We've primarily been looking at works written between 1650 and 1750. With the Tenducci disc, we are reaching slightly later into the 1770s, and we plan in future to be playing works by Haydn and Mozart as part of our annual programming and moving forward that way. So again, it's approaching the classical period, actually from what's been before, rather than 20th century ears. That's what we're trying to do, come at it from that angle. Peter, I think, is the first Irish musician to try and deal or tackle the thorny issue of Ireland's relationship with, let's call it, classical music, for want of a better term. And for those people in Ireland who see classical music as being not of us, and we're not unique in that, there are other countries in the world who see classical music as being not part of their culture either. And they see maybe classical music as being either posh or stuck up, or from another planet, or from a different country, How do you think, Peter's strategy, this, I suppose, tendency to tell stories and the ability to tell stories, what do you think that will do for Irish audiences? Let's say you're talking about your 5-year plan in the future. Yes. What will that do for Irish audiences in terms of connecting them to music that is of this city and is of this country? Yeah, I think he's a great advocate for it, because I think with Peter there's no There's no pretentiousness. There's no difficulty in engaging with what he's saying because he's so infectiously enthusiastic and communicates in a very ready, accessible way. That I think that has real reach. And it's something that we've noticed. And we get feedback a lot from people who say, you know, I've never really tried this sort of thing before, but I heard you on Lyric, or I heard Peter on Radio 1, whatever it is. And you know, it does have an effect, it does have a reach, and it shouldn't be underestimated because he's really super at that, at advocating for this work. So I think that is a lot to do with it. It's keeping it open and just giving people the opportunity all the time to engage with what we're putting out there and saying, you know, we're not pretentious about it, and we'd hope that audiences will see that. I mean, I suppose the equivalent is like, I'm going to the National Gallery this afternoon, I have tickets. I don't know anything about art. I know nothing about art, but I like going to look at it. And maybe it's the same with classical music. People don't need to know much about it to come and enjoy it. I'd like to think that's the case. And
I remember seeing an interview with him recently as well, that he said that you were trying to impress upon him about the tantalising line subtitle on a CD, how important that is, you know, and I couldn't agree more. Yes. So when you see titles like Welcome Home, Mr. Dubourg, and The Trials of Tenducci, would it be fair to say that Peter and the IBO puts a human element into the music? I remember many years ago reading an article by Roger Norrington, which was titled, which drew me in immediately, Beethoven Farted Too. Wow. And it was about the humanity. We tend to put composers on pedestals. Yeah. And they are, you know, a composer is in bronze or marble or stone, and they're not animated, and we play this music, and we tend not to connect the music to a real person who did everything else and felt everything else that we felt, but many years ago. Tell us a little bit about the human stories behind the characters who write the music and play the music in the time, and how that brings the music today alive for audiences.
Yes, I think I relate to this very strongly. I remember as a child I was learning the piano when I was about, I don't know, 6 or something, and thinking, you know, why do I need to know who wrote it? I don't know anything about them. It didn't make any sense to me. And then as I got older, starting to find out a bit more. And I think when you're studying music as a child, it's the teachers who tell you a bit more about those composers. They tell you stories that you remember, and you go, oh, okay, this is actually quite interesting, and it makes you want to learn more about it. So hearing about Bach punching a bassoonist outside a pub, or, I mean, he wasn't very well behaved, actually, was he, Bach? We kind of
Bach, no, I think he had I remember I'd seen a documentary of Johnny Allegardini. He spoke about a horn player who came a cropper after dealings with Bach.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important to learn those things. We need to know that they were human and they were fallible and they didn't always get things right. And they composed amazing stuff that we're lucky to have today. I think you need that human element, definitely. It changes how you look at the music. It changes how I look at the music. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit, let's go to the programme that you're actually going to play, the music you're going to play here on the stage of the National Concert Hall. It's like a sandwich.
Yeah, it is.
Where you've got 2 Bach cantatas to open and close the concert, but in the middle we've a Handel sonata. Yes. Now, for those who are not familiar, would say, why is an orchestra playing a sonata? They associate the word sonata with maybe like piano sonatas or violin sonatas that are more solo things. So maybe explain that for listeners and viewers who are maybe not so familiar with the interchangeable terms at the time in the 18th century.
So the term sonata really did have a different meaning back then. In fact, this piece was composed when Handel was in Italy, and there'd been a style set there by Corelli, the Sonata da Chiesa, which was traditionally a 4-movement structure. But Handel had absorbed that and he expanded it. I think there are 6 movements in this particular piece. And he reworked a lot of his old material. You have the sense that when he's in Italy, he's looking back over what he's produced to date, having a bit of a break from London, getting his ideas in order and just recycling some things. And I really like that you'll be listening to the piece and thinking, oh, hang on, I recognise that from the B-flat one. And the way it comes together is a really funny thing, and it's quite heavily influenced by Corelli, so you hear quite a lot of triadic writing and all this stuff. There's a story, actually, that I really hope is true, having talked about storytelling, that when Handel was in Italy, Corelli was his concertmaster, I think, and I believe Corelli had a firm conviction that you shouldn't play above 3rd position on the violin. And Handel had written an overture that went up to the E above the open E string, so one note higher than Corelli's range, and he would just leave it out every time it got to that note, just wouldn't play it. And there's a story that Handel seized the violin from him like in a rage and played the E and then gave it back to him and was just beside himself at this note being missed out, which I love. I really, really hope it's true. I really hope it is. Anyway.
Does that ever happen with the IBO? Does Peter grab a violin off Claire Duff and kind of go, come on, Claire, we can play that high E, you know? Like, and then...
Can you imagine? He probably does play the violin. He seems to play everything else. I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, yeah, he was originally, he still is a bassoonist.
Yeah, he is. He was playing it very recently with the Academy of Ancient Music. Yeah, he does still play the bassoon in addition to the harpsichord. And singing, he sings occasionally. You'll probably have seen him on social media with one of his many videos singing. Anyway, where were we? Handel in Italy. So it's a 6-movement sonata, so it is a different structure to what we might expect. It's different to the later convention of a sonata form in that traditional way. And there will be some little earworms that come in from other things if people are familiar with Handel's other works. It's a great piece, and there's a lovely Passacaglia in it. It's one of my favourites. And so the piece works as a rather nice scene change or palette cleanser or something in between these two weightier works by Bach.
Great. Well, everyone's looking forward to the concert. To finish up, I mean, can you give us what are the tantalising things in your 5-year plan? I mean, I can't wait to find out now, you know, like if...
I can tell you a bit.
What's the future for the IBO?
Well, it's looking good. We are planning to launch a Dublin Handel Fest this summer in partnership with the OPW at Dublin Castle, which is great, with support from the American Donor Fund and the Goethe Institute. Going forward, to celebrate our 25th anniversary towards the end of the year, we'll be performing the complete Brandenburg concertos on stage at the NCH, and we'll be performing the Messiah with Chamber Choir Ireland at the end of the year. We have more stories in the pipeline for CDs. A working title for one of them, I will share this with you because I love it, is Mr. Charles the Hungarian, is the name of the disc, and it's looking at Handel's horn player, who apparently was quite a character. So, of course, because it's a Peter Whalen programme, he was quite a character, we can assume. So there is a lot there. The Handel Fest will be hopefully a recurring event annually, and so there are more recordings, more Handel, more stories. That's the gist of it, really.
Well, Aliye, thanks a million for talking to me today, and the very best of luck with your concert with the IBO. We're all great looking forward to it.
Me too. Thanks.